In 1998, everything seemed written. Jordan had closed the story like no one else had in the history of sports. In Utah, Game 6, the ball in his hands, Byron Russell falling as if pushed by a ghost, and that clean shot that froze time, 6 rings, 2 three-peats, 3-time finals MVP in a row. It was the perfect ending to a perfect career, a moment so flawless that even Hollywood would have fallen short. And of course, the world bought into that idea. Michael Jordan hadn't just dominated the NBA, he had tamed an entire generation. The 90s were his. The league, the brands, the culture, even the video games. Retiring there at the absolute peak made him a myth without cracks. What more could you ask for? But the problem is that Jordan was never a normal guy. While everyone worshipped him as a retired god, he was still a caged, competitive animal. He could be smoking a cigar, betting fortunes in the casino, or playing 36 holes of golf like it was the World Cup final, but deep down there was something he couldn't turn off: the need to compete. And that need started to bother him because the world was moving on without him. The NBA had new stars, teams were chasing new dynasties, and while everyone celebrated his perfect ending, Jordan watched from the outside with anger. That mix of ego, pride, and hunger that had made him unstoppable was still there. Logically, you'd think with almost 40 years, worn-out knees, a messed-up finger from a cigar cutter, and an untouchable legacy, the best thing was to stay still. No one in their right mind would risk ruining such a perfect story. No one, except Michael Jordan. Because if the NBA learned anything, it's that every time you thought you'd seen it all from him, Jordan had a way of coming back to humiliate you. After his glorious retirement, Jordan didn't disappear from the map. He wasn't one of those guys who escaped to a private island so no one would bother them. On the contrary, he came back as a suit man, president of basketball operations for the Washington Wizards, and a minority owner. Suddenly, the guy who used to decide games with a last-second shot had to decide who to cut, who to sign, how to rebuild a team that couldn't beat anyone. And here's something people don't often talk about. Jordan was just as competitive in the front office as he was on the court, but not always with the same results. His first big move was to clean house. Get rid of veterans, move players like Juwan Howard, cut guys like Rod Strickland, and bet on a future that, at least on paper, sounded promising. The result, 19 wins for the whole season. One of the worst campaigns in the league. Of course, the draft lottery gave him the first pick, and Jordan went with a high school kid named Kwame Brown. That pick is still remembered as one of the biggest disappointments in NBA history. But Kwame's selection wasn't just a scouting mistake, it was also an X-ray of a frustrated executive Jordan trying to mold a teenager into his own clone, and running into the reality of a kid who could never handle that weight. Meanwhile, Jordan couldn't help himself. He jumped into practices, played with the young guys, challenged them, humiliated them one-on-one. Richard "Rip" Hamilton still remembers how the president of his team came down to the court and made him look like a rookie to his face. That mentoring, which seemed charming at first, was actually hiding something much bigger. Jordan was testing himself to see if he could still do it. At the same time, he brought back an old friend, Doug Collins, his first coach in Chicago, someone who understood his personality, his ego, his quirks. And that move was the final piece of a puzzle that had already been laid out. Jordan didn't just want to lead from the top, he wanted to play again. The suit was suffocating him, the office bored him, and watching the Wizards lose drove him crazy. He said he was inspired by Mario Lemieux, the hockey legend who came out of retirement to play again in the NHL. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. Jordan never could stand the idea of his story being over. Jordan could sign contracts, cut players, even ruin a rookie's life with a single front office decision, but that wasn't his nature. He didn't belong in marble hallways or elegant offices in Washington. He belonged on the hardwood. And every time he came down to practice with the Wizards, he made that crystal clear. Rip Hamilton experienced it firsthand. 23 years old, fresh legs, hungry for glory, and across from him, an executive in a suit who looked more like a memory than a rival. Until Jordan took him one-on-one, fakes, surgical footwork, the shot falling as smooth as ever, Rip couldn't do a thing. And the worst part came after. That cold, arrogant look as if to say, I'm the president, but I'm still better than you. That was the real issue. Jordan couldn't accept watching the NBA from the sidelines. Every Wizards loss bled him dry, every mistake drilled into him. And while his body aged and rusted, his mind remained sharp, just as dangerous as it had been in the 90s. That combination was eating him alive. The moves he made as an executive, like bringing back Doug Collins, seemed like chess pieces for a young team. But in reality, they were part of a personal board he was quietly setting up. Jordan was preparing his own return, even if he wasn't saying it out loud yet. When the news broke, the world split in two. Those who worshipped him, fearing he would stain the perfection of his legacy, and those who hated him, convinced he would fail. They judged him for his age, for his worn-out knees, for a finger ruined in a household accident. What no one understood was that for Jordan, the real failure was sitting on the sidelines watching the game go on without him. And that's the most brutal part of all. His return wasn't a whim. It was a declaration of war against the NBA, against the doubters, against time, and above all, against himself. The Jordan who returned to the NBA was no longer the same one who had flown from the free throw line or hung Patrick Ewing from the rim at Madison Square Garden. That body was broken. Tendinitis in his knee, an index finger poorly healed from the cigar cutter accident, years of inactivity and excess. The man who once lived in the air now had to drag heavy, aching legs that no longer responded to his will. But that became his reinvention. Jordan understood he could no longer win through explosiveness, so he moved the battle to the mental arena. He became a surgeon on the hardwood, millimetric fakes, footwork that dismantled younger defenders, that deadly mid-range jumper that hadn't dulled with time. He was no longer Air Jordan. He was something else, something more human, but just as devastating. The incredible thing was that even in this grounded version, he could still outplay anyone. The first reality check came in preseason games, knees wrapped, breathing heavy, but with an undiminished ability to find gaps no one else could see. He no longer went over you, he tricked you, confused you, made you think you had him under control, and by the time you reacted, the ball was already going in. That contrast was brutal for the league. Because in everyone's mind, a nearly 40-year-old Jordan was supposed to be a caricature of himself, a pathetic shadow, but what they got was an assassin who, even though he could no longer fly, he had learned how to kill from the ground. The man who lost his wings still had his claws, and there was nothing more dangerous than a Jordan forced to play with human rage. Jordan's return couldn't go unnoticed. Everyone was watching with a magnifying glass, journalists, fans, young players who had grown up watching him on VHS. Could he really keep up, or was he going to become a ridiculous veteran, a footnote in his own legend? The first setting couldn't have been more symbolic: Madison Square Garden. The same court where he had had historic nights with the Bulls now welcomed him wearing blue, a uniform that felt strange to many, and yet the essence was still there. The Knicks put pressure on him, the crowd waited for him to fall, and Jordan scored his first official points with the Wizards as if he had been born for that stage. Days later in Atlanta, the world got the most powerful proof that he hadn't returned just to give a few interviews. At 38 years old, after 3 seasons without competing, Jordan rose up mid-game and threw down a dunk that silenced the arena. It was a moment of madness, as if time had rewound, as if the 90s had returned for a few seconds. And after that, he kept pouring in points, even pulling off a vintage move, and up and under that brought back memories of the Bulls-era Jordan. That night ended with 31 points and the first Wizards win. And it was enough to spark a fire no one had expected. Because if Jordan could still do that, what else did he have left in store? Of course, not everything was a fairy tale. His shooting percentages early on were low, hovering around 37%, and the Wizards piled up losses that made everyone doubt. People started calling him Floor Jordan, as if he had gone from dominating the air to crawling on the floor. The critics were ready to eat him alive. But here's the thing, the more they questioned him, the more he lit up. And those first trials by fire, between doubt and flashes of greatness, set the stage for what was to come. The nights that would prove that even with a limited body, Jordan could still humiliate the entire NBA. What came next was a brutal reminder of who Michael Jordan was. Because you could say he was old, that he'd lost his legs, that he couldn't fly anymore, but a 40-year-old could still destroy 20-somethings with a level of skill they couldn't even dream of. The night of December 29th, 2001 was the ultimate proof. He was coming off one of the worst games of his career, 6 points, 2 for 10 from the field. Everyone was saying, that's it, he's done. And in the very next game against the Charlotte Hornets, he dropped 51 points. Yes, 51. At nearly 40 years old, Jordan tore apart defenders young enough to be his sons, using the mid-range like a hot knife through butter, fakes, step-backs, impossible shots, and every time the ball went in, the arena exploded. As if that weren't enough, in the following game against the Nets, he did it again. 45 points, including a streak of 22 straight without missing a single shot. A massacre. The entire NBA had to swallow the words they'd been repeating since his return, that Jordan was finished. What was finished was the pride of the defenders who had no idea how to guard him. The most striking part was that he was no longer doing it through physical dominance, but with patience and surgical precision. Every fake, every spin, every step was designed to humiliate his opponent. It was a more grounded Jordan, yes, but also a more cruel one. A surgeon with a sharpened knife who knew exactly where to cut, and if those 2 nights seemed unrepeatable, In February 2003, he showed he still had bullets in the chamber. Just after turning 40, he dropped 45 points on the New Orleans Hornets, another museum-worthy performance. And shortly after came one of the most symbolic matchups of his final stretch, facing Grant Hill. Hill was broken with a shattered ankle, but insisted on playing to face his idol one last time. The result was cruel. Jordan lit him up for 32 points, and Hill aggravated his injury so badly that he missed the rest of the season. It was a painfully ironic moment. The man many had once seen as Jordan's heir was left behind, undone by injuries, and by Jordan himself, who at 40 could still ruin your night. For the NBA, those nights were a silent humiliation. Because it didn't matter if you were a rising star or a role player, when you faced Michael, you became part of a stat line nobody wanted to belong to. Jordan wasn't just playing at 40, he was making it clear that even in that version of himself, even with clipped wings, he could still be the best player on the court. When people talk about Wizards-era Jordan, the collective memory tends to focus on the points. The 51, the 45, the 30, and 40-point nights at age 40. But there's a side of that version of him that's almost always overlooked, and it was just as important, his defense. Back in the 80s, Jordan had been both Most Valuable Player and Defensive Player of the Year in the same season, an achievement reserved for a chosen few. And while in Washington he no longer had the same legs, he was still a relentless hound. The explosiveness was gone, but the strength and intelligence remained intact. Allen Iverson, who embodied the present of the league, ran into a Jordan who still knew how to make life hell on defense. Iverson was the MVP, the young face of the NBA, but when Jordan took him on for stretches, he forced tough shots, pushed him away from his favorite spots, and proved that experience could outweigh speed. It wasn't just about the box score, it was that feeling that, even at twice his age, Jordan could still clamp down when he wanted to. Kobe Bryant experienced the same reality. Kobe had modeled his entire game after Jordan, mimicking every move, every gesture, but when he faced him, he found an unexpected wall. A veteran who defended with pride, who pushed him into the post, who used his body to wear him down. Jordan didn't have the legs anymore, but he made up for it with strength, intelligence, and an instinct that let him anticipate every move. Kobe wanted to break him, and Jordan, at 40, was still there to remind him that he'd learned every trick from him. That was the other side of his comeback. It wasn't just about scoring and looking good on offense, it was a silent message. At 40, with knees that were shut, he could still defend like a dog and make you uncomfortable every time you touched the ball, because Jordan didn't understand basketball any other way. He could lose speed, he could lose vertical leap, but he was never going to lose the instinct to ruin your night, to remind you that against him, you were never going to be comfortable, not even for a second. Jordan's return was also a test for an entire generation that had grown up watching him as a god and now had to face him head-on. He was no longer the Jordan of the 90s, but even at 40, he forced those young players to measure their own ambitions against his shadow. Kevin Garnett was pure energy at 25 with an imposing physique and intensity off the charts, and yet when he came up against Jordan, he realized that brute force wasn't always enough. Michael wore him down with intelligence, with experience, with the same obsession as always. Garnett later admitted what it meant to play against him, a matchup unlike anything he had ever experienced, a reminder that there were still things to learn. Grant Hill, on the other hand, lived that encounter with a special kind of drama. He was the man many had labeled as Jordan's natural successor, until injuries derailed his career. In 2002, with a destroyed ankle, Hill insisted on stepping on the court one last time to face his idol, and what he found was a nightmare. Jordan scored 32 points on him, and Hill aggravated his injury so badly that he missed the rest of the season. It was almost poetic and cruel, the heir who never could be, falling precisely in his attempt to measure himself against the master. And then there was Vince Carter, Air Canada, the man with impossible dunks, the league's new showman. Carter represented the future of entertainment, but he understood history all too well. In 2003, at the All-Star Game, he gave up his starting spot to Jordan as a gesture of respect. He could jump higher, he was in better shape, but he knew there was still a king who had to be honored. These weren't just games. They were confirmation that Jordan wasn't a retired player clinging to the past. He was still the standard by which an entire generation measured itself. And in every matchup, through scoring, through defense, or just by presence, he kept reminding them that his shadow was still far too long to escape. The real hell of Jordan's return wasn't out on the court, it was inside his own locker room. Because living with Michael was never a peaceful experience, it was a constant test, a giant magnifying glass on every mistake, a ticking clock reminding you that you were sharing the floor with the man who had turned the NBA into a religion. Richard "Rip" Hamilton figured it out quickly. He admired Jordan, sure, but every practice was torture. Jordan didn't take him by the hand, he dragged him into the post, battered him with endless fakes, and hit shot after shot in his face just to remind him who was in charge. And then came that look, cold, defiant, the same one he used on his opponents. Rip learned, no doubt, but at the cost of bruised ego. Jerry Stackhouse was a different story. He hadn't come to Washington to be a pawn on anyone's board. He arrived with star status and his own pride and ran headfirst into a 40-year-old Jordan who still wanted to be the first offensive option. What should have been a partnership turned into an invisible boxing ring, contested shots, silent arguments, burning glares. Stackhouse never accepted being a sidekick, and Jordan never accepted sharing his throne. Larry Hughes watched it all from the sidelines trying to grow, but Jordan pushed him mercilessly. And Charles Oakley, the old bodyguard from Chicago, was back more as a witness than a player, a symbol that Michael needed someone from his generation just to survive in a room full of kids who didn't understand his code. That locker room was a pressure cooker. Some saw Jordan as the ultimate teacher. Others lived him as an unbearable shadow that wouldn't let them breathe, because with him there was no middle ground. You either idolized him or you hated him, but never ignored him. If there was one thing Jordan couldn't negotiate, it was his pride, and that pride led him to push a body that was already crying out for help. By the end of the 2001 to 2002 season, his knees were a battlefield, chronic tendonitis, constant swelling, pain with every movement, and still, he played. He played because he didn't know how to do anything else. The breaking point came when he simply couldn't go on and had to go under the knife. Surgery in the middle of the season with a real chance of missing the rest of the year. For anyone else, it would have been the end, the perfect excuse to retire again with dignity. But Jordan didn't operate on excuses. Just 11 games after the operation, he returned to the court and dropped 34 points on Milwaukee in just 26 minutes. On one leg, insanity. He paid a high price. His body was cracking, the pain was constant, but every time he stepped on the court, he did it with the same ferocity as always. It didn't matter if he had to wrap his knees like they were made of glass, didn't matter if his body was failing him. Jordan wanted the world to see that he could still dominate. And in his final season after turning 40, he gave the clearest sign of that stubbornness. While anyone else in his situation would have paced themselves, he played all 82 games of the schedule. No rest, no breaks. His body was broken, but his mind told him he had to be there every night, in every city, on every court. It was almost suicidal, but it was Jordan. That sacrifice was proof that his return wasn't a marketing stunt or some cheap nostalgic trip. He was literally leaving blood, sweat, and cartilage on the court to show that even in the most human version of himself, he could still be a giant. Jordan was no longer the guy who defied gravity. Now he was a veteran, dragging himself through pain but still killing you from mid-range. And maybe that was the most impressive part, accepting that he couldn't fly anymore and still making you feel small. In 2002 to 2003, Jordan knew there was no turning back. It was his final season. He announced it calmly, but the NBA understood immediately. Every city, every arena, every opponent began treating him for what he was, a king on his farewell tour. The most symbolic gesture came from Vince Carter at the All-Star Game in Atlanta. Carter, the league's new aerial attraction, gave up his starting spot to Jordan. It was a gesture of absolute respect, the air of the impossible dunks handing the stage to the man who had turned flight into art. And when the ovation hit, with all the players surrounding him at midcourt, it was clear this wasn't just a tribute, it was an entire generation bowing to their living god. Chicago, his old home, had its moment too. The United Center welcomed him one last time with endless applause, a mix of nostalgia and gratitude. He was no longer the red-clad 23 who had led the Bulls to Olympus, but when the ball touched his hands, the crowd rose as if time had never passed. That night, the points didn't matter. What mattered was the memory. And the same thing happened in every arena. In New York, in Boston, in Los Angeles, entire crowds applauding the opponent, players chasing handshakes, coaches paying their respects. Even the referees seemed aware they were officiating the final act of a legend. The most impressive part? That in the middle of this farewell tour, Jordan never lowered his standards. This wasn't a traveling museum. He played all 82 games, and on several nights, he still dropped 30 or 40 points like he wanted to leave you with a painful memory to go along with the autograph. It was his way of saying, you honor me, sure, but I can still kill you. Jordan's final tour wasn't just a goodbye, it was confirmation that his shadow was still too big for the league. You could applaud him, hand him flowers, show him respect, but every time the ball touched his hands, you felt the same thing you always did, fear. When the final buzzer of his career sounded, Jordan didn't walk away with a championship or a movie-perfect photo like in '98. His last act was something else entirely, a 40-year-old veteran who had endured pain, surgeries, and frustration, yet was still capable of stealing entire nights and being cheered like a god in every city he visited. The strange part is that while the entire league honored him, his own franchise treated him with indifference. Abe Pollin let him walk away without fulfilling the promise of reinstating him in the front office. It was a cold, almost unfair ending for someone who had put his body and name on the line for a team that never rose to his level. And yet that contrast says a lot, because even if Washington showed him the back door, basketball had already immortalized him. The missed playoffs and the Wizards' record didn't matter. What mattered was that at 40, even without wings, Jordan was still the most feared man on the court. His farewell wasn't a perfect storybook ending, it was rougher, more human, and perhaps for that very reason, even more powerful, because it showed that some figures don't need titles to stay alive, and Jordan, even in his most vulnerable form, was still eternal. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. This was Hoop Secrets, and I'll see you next time.